Some warnings don't tell you what to be afraid of. They tell you what not to do. And the not doing is the whole of it. In the autumn of 1934, in a fold of the Boston Mountains, where the Ozarks run their deepest, a surveyor named Elias Whitlock was told to keep his eyes on the ground, not away from the ridge, not down at his feet, on the ground. There is a difference, and the difference is the thing that took him 40 years to understand. An old Cherokee woman gave him 3 rules the night before he went up. 2 of them he could follow. The third one broke him. She told him not to count the things that walk the ridges at night, not to number them, not to keep a tally, not even in his head. He was a man of measurement. Counting was the one thing he could not stop doing. This is what he carried down off that mountain. This is what he told me on a screened porch in Fort Smith in the summer of 1976. An old man with a surveyor's chain still coiled in his closet, who had not slept a full night in more than 4 decades. Sit with it, start to finish, the way he gave it to me. Elias Whitlock came to the mountains with numbers and left with something he could not put a number on. In the fall of 1934, he was 31 years old, employed by a land company out of Little Rock that wanted the timber rights along a stretch of high ground the locals called the 9 Sisters. 9 ridges, running roughly parallel, like the fingers of a hand pressed into wet clay and then withdrawn. His job was simple and lonely. Walk the ridge lines, run the chain, drive the stakes, mark the corners. Come down, do it again the next day, 1 ridge over. The company wanted the whole hand mapped before the first snow. He had done this work for 9 years. He was good at it. Whitlock was the kind of man who found comfort in the fact that the world could be reduced to figures. So many chains east, so many links north, an elevation you could read off an aneroid barometer and trust. He did not believe in much that could not be written into a field book. That was the trouble with him. That was the exact shape of the door the mountain would find. The nearest town was a place called Cane Hollow, which was not really a town, just a store and a church, and a scatter of houses along a creek that ran brown after rain. He took a room above the store. It was a narrow room with 1 window that looked up the draw toward the base of the ridges, and on that first night, he stood at the window a while, looking at the black line of the high ground against the stars, and he told me he remembered thinking it looked like a wall, not a range of hills, a wall built to keep something on one side of it. The man who ran the store, a widower named Coleman, was a careful, unhurried sort who took a long time to say a short thing. He gave Whitlock supper on the house that first night, which was generous for a man who clearly had little. And while Whitlock ate, Coleman told him that the company had sent 2 surveyors up the 9 Sisters before him. Whitlock asked what had happened to them. Coleman said the first one quit, said he came down after 4 days, drew his pay by mail from Little Rock, and never set foot in the county again. Wouldn't say why, just packed his instruments and walked to the road and was gone before noon. Whitlock asked about the second. Coleman was quiet for a moment, wiping the same spot on the counter that was already clean. Then he said the second one didn't come down. Whitlock waited for the rest of it. The when, the how, the search party, the body. That was the shape a story like that was supposed to take. But Coleman just kept wiping the counter, and after a while, it became clear that was the whole of what he was going to say. The second one didn't come down, as though the sentence was already complete, as though there was nothing missing from it at all. I want to stop here, because this is the part Elias circled back to on that porch, again and again, like a man worrying a stone in his pocket. He said the strange thing was not that a man had gone missing on the ridges. Men went missing in those mountains all the time. Bad footing, flash floods, a broken ankle 9 miles from a road. The strange thing was that nobody in Cane Hollow would say the second surveyor was dead. They said he didn't come down, as though those were two entirely different things, as though there were a third state a man could be in, up on those ridges, that was neither living nor gone. Whitlock, being who he was, filed this away as superstition and slept fine. A man who has spent 9 years in remote country learns that every isolated place has its stories, and that the stories are almost always a way of explaining an accident nobody wanted to look at directly. A drowning becomes a river haint. A man who freezes to death becomes something that called him out into the snow. It was, he thought, a kindness people did themselves to make the meaningless into something with a shape. He spent the next 2 days on the first 2 ridges without trouble. The work was hard, but the weather held. He ran his chain, drove his stakes, filled his field book with tidy columns of figures. Each ridge was a long day's climb, a day's careful work along the crest, and a long descent in the failing light. At night, he came down to the store and ate what Coleman's daughter cooked. She was a grave, quiet girl of about 16, who watched him eat and never spoke to him once, and he slept the sleep of a tired man. He noticed only one small thing in those first 2 days, and he only noticed it because noticing was his profession. The ridges were empty of game, not quiet, empty. In 9 years of survey work in wild country, he had never walked a full day of timber without cutting deer sign, turkey scratch, the diggings of hogs. On the first 2 sisters, there was nothing. No droppings, no beds, no tracks but his own. The birds sang in the low ground and fell silent above a certain line, as though there were an elevation on that mountain the living had simply agreed not to cross. He wrote it in his field book as a note on the timber value and did not let himself think past it. It was on the 3rd evening that Coleman told him he ought to go and see the old woman before he went any higher. Her name, as near as Whitlock could ever render it, was a Cherokee word he spelled phonetically in his field book, and later couldn't be sure he had right. The people in the hollow called her by a shorter name that meant, roughly, the one who stayed. She had been born on that mountain before the removals, or her mother had. The stories differed. She had somehow never left when the others were driven west. She lived alone in a cabin up the first draw, and she was, Coleman said, the only person in the county who had lived on the 9 sisters and come down whole. Whitlock did not want to go. He went because Coleman would not let it drop, and because some small part of him, the part that had heard, didn't come down and not been able to fully file it away, wanted to. The cabin sat where the draw pinched shut against the base of the 3rd ridge. It was near dark when he reached it. There was a fire going, and the old woman was sitting outside it rather than in, which struck him as odd until he understood, much later, that she wanted to be able to see the ridgeline above her while there was still light to see it. She was very old. He could not have guessed how old, and he was a man who took the measure of things for a living. Her face was folded and folded again, and her eyes, when they moved to him, moved slowly, as though there was a great weight of years behind them that had to be turned like a wheel. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she did not get up. There was a dog somewhere back in the dark of the cabin that never came out and never stopped watching him. He could feel it more than see it. She let him stand there a while before she spoke, and he had the strong sense that she was not deciding whether to talk to him, but deciding how much it was worth telling a man who would not believe it. He knew that look. He would come to understand much later that it was the look of someone who has given a warning many times and buried most of the people she gave it to. She spoke English better than he expected, slow and exact, choosing each word as though words cost her something. She asked him what company had sent him, and he told her. She asked him which ridge he had reached, and he told her that too. He'd finished the second, he'd start the third in the morning, working his way across toward the ninth. When he said the ninth, something changed in her face. Not fear, he was clear about that. It was closer to grief. The look of a person watching someone step off a curb into a street they cannot see the traffic on. She was quiet a while after that. Then she said the thing he would carry the rest of his life. She said the company should have stopped at the seventh. She said past the seventh, the ridges did not belong to the daylight anymore, and the man who went up onto the eighth or the ninth was making a promise he did not know he was making. He asked her, reasonably, what she meant, and she told him she would give him 3 rules, and if he kept all 3, he would come down, and that if he broke even one, she could not say what would come down in his place. I asked him, on that porch, whether he believed her in the moment, whether he sat by that fire and felt the truth of it. He said no. He said he sat there thinking she was a sad, strange old woman with a head full of the past, and he felt sorry for her, and he memorized her 3 rules the way you'd humor a grandmother, to be kind, not because you meant to obey. And then he looked at me and he said, I have kept 2 of those rules every single day for 42 years. I keep them still. I will keep them until I die. It was the 3rd one he couldn't keep, and that, he said, is why I don't sleep. The 3 rules. He gave them to me in the order she gave them to him, and I'll give them to you the same way. The first rule was this: when you make your fire at night, make it small and do not feed it after full dark. A big fire, she said, is a light that says here, and there are things on the high ridges that have been waiting a very long time for something to say here. The second rule: if you hear your own name called from below your camp, from down the slope, you may answer it. If you hear your name called from above you, from higher on the ridge, you must not answer, not even to say no. Whatever is above you at night on the 9 sisters, she said, is not something that should know your name, and if it learns you'll answer, it will use the knowing. And the third rule, the one he broke, she was slower giving him this one. She made him lean in for it. Do not count the things that walk the ridges at night. You will see them, she told him. You'll see shapes moving along the spine of the ridge, on the far side, against the last light. And when you see them, she said, the wanting will come up in you like water, the wanting to know how many. That wanting is the trap. It is built into you, she said, into all your kind. This need to put a number to a thing so you can hold it, but you must not. You must not number them. Because the counting, she said, is a door. Watching them does nothing. They have been watched for 200 years and it costs them nothing. But to count is different. To count is to reach across and lay your hand on them, one by one, and say you are one, and you are one, and you are one. It is the only thing a living man can do from his side of it that they can feel from theirs. Watch if you must, but do not count. Do not let the number form. And if it begins to form, she said, look away and think of something you can hold in your hands, and do not let the last of the number arrive. He asked her, of course he asked her, what they were. She looked at the fire for a long time, and she said only that they were the ones who had gone up and been counted and stayed, that every one of them had once been a man who climbed those ridges and did the one thing she was telling him not to do, and she would say nothing more, except that there were fewer of them once, and there would be more of them after, and that this had been true for longer than her grandmother's grandmother, and would be true long after the last person who remembered to warn against it, was gone from the earth. He went up the third ridge the next morning and nothing happened. He went up the fourth and the fifth over the following days and nothing happened. The rules began to feel like what he'd assumed they were, the folklore of a lonely old woman, and he half forgot them. He kept his fires small, but that was only good sense in dry timber. He heard nothing call his name from above or below, because the ridges were, in the daytime, simply beautiful and empty. The land company would get its map. He would get his pay. The old woman would become a story he told at dinner parties, the strange Cherokee grandmother and her 3 rules. It was on the 7th ridge that it started to change, and he wanted me to understand that it changed slowly, the way the temperature changes, so that you don't notice you're cold until you're already shaking. The 7th ridge was higher than the others, and the timber on it was different, older, the trees farther apart, the ground beneath them clear in a way that felt swept, not burned over, swept. He kept using that word on the porch, and I kept picturing it. A forest floor with no leaf litter, no deadfall, no undergrowth, as though something passed along it often enough and regularly enough to wear it smooth, the way a path wears smooth in a yard. He ran his chain across it, and his figures came back wrong. Not wildly wrong. That was the thing that unsettled him. Wildly wrong he could have blamed on a bent pin or a misread vernier. This was worse. This was wrong by a little, and consistent in its wrongness, which is the signature of something real. Distances that didn't close, a traverse that should have returned to its starting corner and instead came back short, every time, no matter how carefully he ran it. He was a surveyor. A closed traverse that will not close is, to a man like Whitlock, very nearly a physical impossibility. It means the space you measured across is not the space you think it is. He ran it again slower, checking every setup. It came back short. He ran it a third time, resetting his chain, redriving his hubs, treating himself as the likely error, short. He ran it a fourth time in a cold sweat, and it came back short by exactly the amount it had come back short the other 3 times. 9 links. Every time. 9. Like the 9 ridges. He sat down on a rock on the crest of the 7th sister and wrote the figure in his field book and looked at it for a long time, and the swept ground stretched away from him in both directions, and somewhere below the tree line the birds had stopped. He told me he sat down on the 7th ridge that afternoon and did something he had never done in 9 years of survey work. He erased a measurement. He took a good, honest figure that his chain had given him 4 times over, and he wrote down a different number instead. A number that closed. A lie, in a field book, from a man who had built his whole life on the idea that numbers don't lie. He said he didn't know why he did it. He said it was the first time the mountain made him do something against his own nature, and it would not be the last. He should have gone down after the 7th. The old woman had told him plainly. The company should have stopped at the 7th, but there were 2 ridges left, the 8th and the 9th, and a full field book, and a land company that paid by the completed map. He was so close. He told himself it was 2 more days. He made camp that night on the saddle between the 7th ridge and the 8th, higher than he'd ever slept on that mountain. And that is where, for the first time, he saw them. It was just after full dark. His fire was small. He'd kept that rule out of habit by now. He was writing up the day's figures by the last of the light when something made him look up, across the saddle, to the spine of the 8th ridge standing black against a sky that was not quite finished going dark. There were shapes on it, moving along the ridgeline, upright, more or less, walking, more or less, spaced apart, in a line, following the crest from one end toward the other, slow and even and unhurried, the way a man walks when he has walked a path so many times his body no longer consults him about it. He tried, that night on the porch, to describe them to me, and he couldn't. And the fact that he couldn't was worse than any description would have been. He said they were person-shaped the way a coat on a hook is person-shaped, that your eye read them as a figure, and then, if you held on it, the reading fell apart, and you were looking at something that had the outline of a walking man, and none of the inside of one. They were darker than the dark behind them. That was the one thing he was sure of. Against a sky that still held a little light, they were absolute black, holes in the shape of men, and the last of the daylight did not touch them at all. They made no sound. That distance across a saddle, you wouldn't expect much. But there was a quality to the silence, he said, that a real procession of real men could not have had. Their feet found the crest, and the crest gave nothing back, and they did not look around, or up, or down, or at each other. They only went along the spine of the ridge in that slow, even, unhurried line towards some end of the mountain that Whitlock could not see. His first feeling, he told me, was not fear. It was a kind of recognition, which was far worse, because part of him had been waiting for this since the old woman spoke. And now, here it was, and the waiting was over. And the waiting had been the last comfortable thing he had. He watched them cross the ridge. He kept his fire small. He did not call out, and nothing called to him. He obeyed the first rule and the second rule without even deciding to. And then his eyes, on their own, without his permission, began to do the thing they had done every working day of his adult life. They began to count. 1 shape, 2, 3, 4, 5, moving along the crest. He caught himself at 5 and stopped, and his heart was going hard because he understood in that instant that the counting was not a neutral act. He'd felt something happen at 5, something on the ridge, some fraction of that slow procession had not stopped, exactly, hesitated, as though 5 of them had for just a moment felt themselves be 5. He looked away. He shut his eyes. He said the numbers of the field book in his head, the safe ones, the ones from lower down that closed. He did not count again that night. He barely slept, but he did not count. And in the morning, the 8th ridge was empty and ordinary and green. Here is what he wanted me to understand. And here is where I have to be honest with you about what kind of story this is. Elias Whitlock was not a fanciful man. He spent his whole life measuring the physical world and trusting it. And what he told me, an old man who had nothing left to prove and no reason to lie to a stranger with a tape recorder, was that the counting reached them, that the numbering was a rope thrown across the dark, that the old woman had been exactly right, in the most literal possible way. To count them was to touch them, and to touch them was to be, from that moment, known. I can't tell you it happened. I can tell you a man believed it happened with his whole body, 40 years on, and that when he described the moment 5 of them felt themselves be 5, my own arms went cold on a warm summer porch, and I have never entirely gotten warm about it since. He did the sensible thing the next day, or what a sensible man does when he's already half a fool. He climbed the 8th ridge in full daylight, fast, ran the corners as quick as he could, drove his stakes, and got off it before the light began to go. 1 ridge left, he told himself if he could just do the 9th the same way, up fast, work fast, down before dark, he would be finished and paid and gone from that county forever. But the 9th ridge was the highest and the longest, and the work could not be rushed, and the afternoon ran out from under him. He was still driving corners when the sun went down behind the ridge and put him in shadow, while the valley below him was still gold. He should have gone down in the dark. Instead, he made one more camp, the last one. On the crest of the 9th ridge itself, the highest ground on the whole mountain. The ridge the old woman had told him no man should ever spend a night upon. He said he knew, even as he laid his fire, that he was doing something wrong. He kept the fire small. He got out his field book to close the day's figures, the last figures, the map nearly done. And the shapes came up onto the 9th ridge with him. They did not come along the far crest this time, across a saddle, safely distant. They came up out of the timber on both sides of him, silently, the way water comes up around your boots when you've stood too long in a marsh and only notice once it's over the leather. They gathered onto the ridgeline where he sat, and they walked the crest past his small fire, near enough that he could have reached out and put his hand through one of them, near enough that he could have counted the steps they took if he had let himself count anything. He did not look at them directly. He'd learned that much on the saddle. He kept his eyes down, on his field book, on the safe columns of figures from the lower ridges, the ones that closed, and he let the shapes move at the edges of his sight, a slow procession passing through his camp, as though he were a stone in a stream they had flowed around for 100 years. They passed close enough that he should have felt the air move, and the air did not move. Close enough that a real man's body throws a warmth you can feel, and there was no warmth. If anything, the cold deepened as each one drew level with him. A cold that came off them the way heat comes off a stove, and passed, and came again with the next. He kept his eyes on the field book. He said the numbers of the lower ridges to himself, over and over, not to count them, but to give the counting part of his mind something else to hold. He very nearly made it, and it might have been all right. He might have kept his 3 rules to the end and walked down off that ridge at dawn hole, the way the old woman had, and become an old man who tells the story of the night he didn't count. That was the version of him that was still possible, right up until the moment it wasn't. Because as the last of them passed his fire, some animal part of his mind, some clerk in the back office of him that had been adding figures his whole life and could not be told to stop, delivered him a total, unasked, complete, a number arriving in his head the way a name arrives when you see a familiar face. There were 41 of them. He had counted, without deciding to, without wanting to. In the one way the old woman had told him would open the door, he had counted, and he had his number, and the number was 41. He stopped on the porch when he got to this part. He stopped for a long time, long enough that I thought the tape had caught him wrong, that he wasn't going to go on. And then he said the thing I have never repeated to anyone until now. He said, the moment I had the number, every one of them stopped walking, all at once. On the whole ridge in the dark, 41 shapes stopped between one step and the next, and they turned, not their bodies. He was very particular about this. Their bodies stayed facing along the crest. Something in them turned toward him, 41 somethings, turning to face the man who had finally, after all the warning, counted them and made them real. And in the dark, he heard his own name called, from above him, from higher on the ridge where there was no higher. He was on the crest, the top of the whole mountain. There was nothing above him but sky, and out of that nothing his name came down, in a voice he said he recognized, though he would never tell me whose it was. He kept the second rule. It was the only thing that saved him. His name came down out of the dark from above, in a voice he knew, and every nerve in him wanted to answer it, and he did not. He bit down on his own hand hard enough to scar, and he did not answer, and he did not count again, and he did not look up. He sat like that until the sky went grey. He did not sleep. He did not move. He listened to his name called from above him over and over in that known voice, patient and even and unhurried, all night long, and he never once answered. When the light came, the ridge was empty. He left his stakes where they were. He left the last corners undriven. He put his field book in his coat, and he went down off the 9th ridge so fast he fell twice and did not care. And he did not stop until he was standing in the draw outside the old woman's cabin. She was sitting by her cold fire pit, as though she had been up all night too. She looked at him, and she did not ask him what had happened. She asked him a single question. She asked him, "How many?" He didn't answer her. He told me he couldn't. His mouth would not make the number, and she saw that he could not, and she closed her eyes, and she nodded once, slowly, the way you nod at news you already knew was coming. Then she told him the last thing she would ever tell him. She said the number he was carrying was one too high now. She said that yesterday, before he went up, there had been 40 of them on the 9 sisters. The 40 who had gone up over all the years and been counted and stayed. The first surveyor had come down because he never counted. The second surveyor was the 40th. And now, she said, there were 41. Not because a 41st thing had joined them on the ridge, but because a 41st would. Because the counting was a promise, and the mountain kept its promises. And the man who counted them was, from that morning forward, a number waiting to be added. Not tonight, maybe not for 50 years, but the ridge had his name now, called down in a voice he knew, and it was patient, and it would wait. She told him to go home, to go far from any high ground, to never sleep a night on a mountain again as long as he lived. And she told him the thing that he said had governed every night of the 42 years since. She said, "Never let yourself be the one who is counted. Keep your own number, hold it. Every night before you sleep, count yourself and be sure the answer is 1. I asked him what she meant. Count yourself and be sure the answer is 1. And he told me that every single night for 42 years, before he lets himself sleep, he lies in the dark and he counts the people in his room. And the answer has to be 1. Just him. Just the 1. Because the night it isn't, the night he counts his own room and the number comes back 2, that will be the night the ridge has finally come down to collect the 41st. And he will hear his name in that voice he knew from somewhere above him in a room that has no above. And this time, he told me, he is not certain he'll have the strength not to answer. Elias Whitlock died in the winter of 1979, 3 years after he told me this, in a single-story house in Fort Smith with no stairs and no attic and no high ground for 40 miles in any direction. He died in his sleep, which the nurse who found him called a mercy. I have wondered since what number he counted in his room that last night, whether it came back 1 and the mountain simply ran out of the years it had been so patient about, or whether it came back 2 and he heard his name, and this time, tired and old and 45 years into not sleeping, he finally let himself answer. I don't have the 3rd rule anymore. Not really. I know what it is. I know not to count them. But knowing the rule and keeping it are 2 different things. The way living and gone are 2 different things. And there is a 3rd state between them that a man can be talked into on a high ridge in the dark. So I'll give you what he gave me, and then I'm going to stop talking because it's getting dark where I am. If you are ever on high ground at night and you see shapes moving along a ridgeline against the last of the light, watch them if you must, but do not count them. Do not number them. Do not let the clerk in the back of your mind hand you a total. And every night, wherever you sleep, low ground or high, count the room before you close your eyes. Be sure the answer is 1.